So the second part of this unit deals with matter cycling through the biosphere. This is huge. It's huge and it's sort of hard, and it's going to require you to put some effort in to make sure you learn these cycles. We're going to try to do some things in class to really emphasize this, but ultimately it is going to take you to sit down and do a little studying so that you know it. The biosphere is the combination of all the ecosystems on Earth, and then this biogeochemical cycles is the movement of matter within and between ecosystems involving biological, geological, and chemical processes. So we're going to start off with what's the hydrologic cycle, which is really just the water cycle. It's the movement of water through the biosphere. Either name works for the name of this cycle. And we do need to know all the vocab and all of the things that go along with this. This is the one that's most familiar to us, so it really sort of makes sense to start with it as the one that we're going to look at. If we look at the diagram, it takes us through it. Solar energy heats Earth and causes evaporation. So we have evaporation of water here from the ocean, which then condenses and makes clouds. We have evaporation of water from the soil, evapotranspiration, which is water moving from plants. Okay, so we have all of these sources of water making its way back into the atmosphere, back into clouds. We then hit the next level, which is precipitation. So water falls back to Earth. It falls as rain or snow or hail back down to Earth. And then precipitation falling on the land is taken up by plants. So plants use that water, runs off along the land surface, and percolates down into the soil to make groundwater, or makes its way back into streams and oceans and stuff. And so we understand this cycle. This is one that we're very, very familiar with, and we start learning it when we're pretty little. So it's a good one to sort of get the idea of cycles out in the open here. So a couple of the vocab words that I mentioned when I was speaking there: transpiration, the process where plants release water from their leaves into the atmosphere. Evapotranspiration is that combined amount of evaporation and transpiration at the same time, looking at that total amount of water that makes its way back into the atmosphere. And then runoff, when water moves across the land surface into streams and rivers, which eventually reaches the ocean. The carbon cycle is our next one. So we have some certain elements that cycle through. We need to take a look at the carbon cycle here. And it's a little bit more complicated. Okay, so we have to take into account where carbon dioxide is found. Carbon is found in carbon dioxide. So we have lots and lots of carbon dioxide. And so we're going to start with atmospheric carbon dioxide, and photosynthesis is going to be used to absorb that carbon dioxide and make it into sugars. Okay, so we have our producers, our autotrophs, who are going to use photosynthesis to make carbon dioxide. The consumers, then we have decomposers and producers, all involved in this, and the sugars are eventually converted back into carbon dioxide. The cells that we have in our bodies use that carbon dioxide and has respiration, which puts it back in. And we know this little part of the carbon cycle pretty well. This is what we talk about, photosynthesis and respiration. We do a lot of that in biology. But then we also, carbon goes other places. Some of this carbon can be buried. And so we have producers that make their way down, and those producers end up being buried. We also have carbon, large carbon sources that are stored way deep underground here. So our fossil fuels, this is our ancient carbon, our ancient sunlight. That sunlight was harvested, and we learned about living on ancient sunlight. So human extraction of fossil fuels brings carbons to the Earth's surface where it can be combusted. So we're extracting that and bringing that up here, through wells and digging and different sources there. Oops, let me go back there. And that's another way that we get more atmospheric. We have combustion, which lets more atmospheric carbon dioxide up into the air. We also have here, we have photosynthesis that takes place in the ocean, through our different algae. And then our organisms in the ocean also undergo respiration. But here's our cycle here of producers and consumers and decomposers. And we also have some of that carbon dioxide or carbon that ends up down in sedimentary rock. So that's another place where carbon dioxide ends up. So this is a very slow but significant part of the carbon cycle. That the carbon there combines with calcium, which is in the ocean water, to form calcium carbonate, which can precipitate out of the water and form limestone and dolomite rock, and contribute to the sedimentary rock. It's a slow, incredibly slow process, but it's the largest carbon pool, or where we find carbon in the slow part of the carbon cycle. Carbon dioxide is constantly exchanged between the atmosphere and the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the other part that I mentioned, we already mentioned here, is that combustion converts fossil fuels and plant material into carbon dioxide. So there's a lot of different places where carbon moves its way through. Probably the most important cycle is the nitrogen cycle. Not only is it the most important, but it's also the most complex. And you do want to make sure that you know all of these terms and you know the ins and outs of this. This little video that I'm going to give you right now is not going to be enough for you to learn this whole cycle. You're going to have to do more ways to reinforce this idea of what's going on here. So if we look here, first we have nitrogen fixation. Okay, so we have 70% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, and it's essential to living things, and so we have to make sure that that nitrogen can make its way into usable forms. It's a key part of how we're able to have so many autotrophs and so many things produced here. So nitrogen fixation converts this atmospheric nitrogen from the atmosphere. So different processes convert the N2 to ammonia, NH3, or abiotic processes convert nitrogen gas into nitrate. Okay, so we have our two different things that sort of needs to be converted into. So we have this nitrogen-fixing bacteria associated with roots, so cyanobacteria, industrial fertilizer production, all of those things. And sometimes lightning and combustion and some industrial fertilizer production can make its way in there. We get to assimilation, which is our second step here. We have assimilation. So producers either take up ammonium, which is NH4, that's that polyatomic that we learned, or nitrate, NO3, that's our other polyatomic. And consumers assimilate nitrogen by eating producers. So the producers assimilate that nitrogen into their structure, and then as consumers, we are eating that nitrogen that the plants have taken in. Okay, so those are our assimilation steps. Ammonification, which is here. Decomposers in the soil and water break down biological nitrogen compounds into ammonium. Okay, so we break down, those things get broken into ammonium, which is that other polyatomic, that NH4 plus that we know. 4, we have nitrification. So nitrifying bacteria convert ammonium into nitrite, NO2, and then add the other oxygen to become nitrate, NO3. And then we end with denitrification here. A series of steps: denitrifying bacteria in oxygen-poor soil or in stagnant water convert nitrates, which is our NO3, into nitrous oxide, N2O, and eventually nitrogen gas. This is by far the most complicated cycle and the one that we sort of have to know the best. So we're going to spend some time making sure that we truly understand the nitrogen cycle. The phosphorus cycle is our last sort of cycle that we need to look at. So if we start here, we have weathering of uplifted rocks contributes phosphates to the land. Some phosphates make their way back into the ocean. So phosphates can work their way down into the cycle. Phosphate is important. It's a major component of DNA, RNA, ATP, all of those things that phosphate, and it's required by plants and animals. It's the limiting nutrient second only to nitrogen in importance for successful agricultural yield. So we really need nitrogen in order to have successful agriculture, but phosphorus is the other thing that we need to look at. It's often added to fertilizer. Nitrogen is always added to fertilizer, phosphorus many times. Phosphorus is also distinguished because it has no gaseous components, which is really, really important. It's the only cycle that doesn't have any sort of gas involved in it. So 2, our second step here, phosphate fertilizer applied to fields can run directly into streams and become part of a soil pool, or be absorbed by plants. So it can run off. We can add fertilizer, that kind of thing, to be absorbed by plants, or it can end up into the water. 3, excretion by animals, and by decomposition with animals and plants, we releases phosphates on lands and into water, so we have decomposition. And then dissolved phosphates precipitate out of solution and contribute to ocean sediments. Conversion of sediments into phosphate rocks is a very slow process, very similar to that calcium carbonate being formed in the carbon cycle. And then 5, making its way back up. Geological forces can slowly lift up phosphate rocks from the ocean floor to form mountains, and then we will continue the cycle around and around. It's not as an engaging of a cycle, and it's a much slower cycle, but it's very important because it's a key part of things that we need in the environment.